If you've ever thought to yourself, I'd rather just read about this than actually do it, you're not alone. The Enneagram 5 newsletter exists to help you move from knowing to experiencing. Every Saturday, you'll get insights designed to help fives grow without overwhelm. Sign up for free today at enneagram5.com/newsletter or visit the link in the description. Now on to the show. We have a special guest. This man, this mythical creature.
We have talked about on the podcast. It's been a long time coming, really. We've said we were going to have him on, and this tonight's after hours very well may be edited into an actual episode later, depending on how well it goes and if he says anything remotely interesting.
Yes, no pressure. So, without further ado,
my brother,
Cody's brother, Jesse Harris.
What's up, brother?
How's it going? I'm here to thoroughly disappoint from the bowels of Boulder, Colorado.
Nice.
Yeah, thanks for that lovely introduction.
You're welcome.
You're welcome. We only the best for you. So we had a bunch of different things we thought about talking about tonight. Nothing was ever fully decided. So I thought maybe we could just start with maybe telling everybody what it is that you do, because I think actually we'll probably get some questions from that in a room full of fives. So yeah, like what is it you're doing in Boulder, Colorado?
So I'm currently at CU as a graduate student. So yeah, I would say I spend most of my time thinking about species. And so let me maybe take one step back, that I'm in an evolutionary biology program. So most of what I think about and do has to do with what we would consider macroevolutionary processes. So speciation, extinction, large scale change over time. And there's some broad topics and there's some very narrow topics. So so speciation biology, there's another chapter of the dissertation that deals with biogeography, which is really just the distribution of species across space and time. So essentially, why are species where they are? But why were they where they were also, right? So we think about the current moment, but also in the past. There's another part of the field that does try to deal with projections into the future and a lot of climate change research. I'm not really into that as much, but mostly just because the models are a little too above my head. However, a lot of what I do is phylogenetic in nature. So evolutionary biology typically involves a lot of phylogeny. So if you've ever seen something, it's a graphical network which allows us to understand relationships among species. And so, yeah, primarily what I'm interested in is systematics, the understanding the relationships of species, looking at phylogenetic trees and what we can actually do with them. So we can actually learn a lot about the species that we're studying just based on like trait evolution, ecology, biogeography, and all of that ties into what we can know by looking at the current set of things and inferring where they came from in the past. And so I guess in a very broad sense, the same way that a geologist would look at rocks and be able to sort of tell you how the features came about, we look at biological species and try to infer where they came from in the past using, like, my primary tool is genetic data, but we also use morphological data, ecological data, biogeographic data. And so, yeah, it's a lot of species diversity questions. But then more in a narrow sense, I also spend maybe about 20% of my time with population biology. So it's more, rather than thinking at the macro scale across lineages, thinking about, like the same species, like, Homo sapiens, but I deal with lineages of plants. And so there's a lot of things that at the population biology level, a lot of processes take place that are of interest to evolutionary biologists, but also you can answer and ask some really cool questions about what's happening right now. And so some aspects of that get into species management. So I deal with some rare or endangered species and look at some processes of how their populations are being affected by human activity, just ecological change, evolutionary change, and how to best preserve some of the biodiversity that we are constantly losing.
Huh.
So there's some practical applications but I probably spend more of my time looking at mathematics papers and being a bit more theoretical than I care to.
What would you say? Oh yeah, I'm tracking 100%.
Okay.
I'm also Googling phylogenetic. And so yeah, you can there is a phylogeographical, which is dealing more with the population biology. So biogeographic, right? So I mentioned the distribution of species across space and time. So why is a species in, we have what's called Eastern North American, Eastern Asian floristic disjunction. So with plants, there's a really cool pattern where you can be in the forests of Eastern North America, right? So you might be like, let's just say you're in the Shenandoahs in Virginia, for instance, or just in a random forest in Pennsylvania. And you're looking around and you see things like sweet gum, and you see hickories, you see oaks, you see some maples, right? You're random trees, but you also see this with like little herbs that are in the understory. Well, then you can take a flight over to Europe and you might see a completely different suite of species. Some of the same genera, families, like, the taxonomic hierarchy. You can see some of the larger groups, other species sometimes, and a lot of things are pretty familiar, but you can walk into a forest in Eastern Asia and feel completely at home. And it's almost surreal where a lot of the same species are there, but they're not really found in between. So it's just a good, fun example of a question of why are they in Eastern Asia and in Eastern North America and nowhere in between? So that's actually a question that has been studied ad nauseum to some extent. And we've learned some cool things, but so we have a biogeographic pattern, but you can actually study that at the population level. So instead of dealing with multiple species, you can call that phylogeography instead. So it's good fun.
Is there anything from your work that you've learned that surprised you?
All the time. Yeah, absolutely. So I guess one of the more pertinent things is just in general, if you walk in, this happens with everyone's daily lives, and it's just a matter of paying attention, but it is on display a bit more obviously, I think, than it is just as we have our own revelations about learning things, but at least learning in a more formal way. It is very neat to walk in with a question, be able to run some experiments or take some data and be able to statistically analyze it and learn something at all. Just to be able to learn anything is, I think, ultimately philosophically surprising, but more or less it's really interesting because it gives me the opportunity to come in and learn, be the first person in the world to learn something. So there are things nearly every day where it's a tangible effect where I get some result, and we can talk about what it means to actually know anything, but within sort of the statistical probability or the likelihood of actually, some event actually taking place and us actually being able to understand anything about it, it is really neat to glean some sort of information and realize that if I die right now, this information is gone.
Mm.
Because it's just a neat feeling to realize, like, oh, I'm the first person to see this.
Is it like as a five? Hopefully everybody's listened to the podcast enough to know that when I've talked about Jesse before, that he's a five. So as a five, I would find, like, you didn't start in this career. You didn't start wanting to do this when you were, I don't know, before you finished high school. Like, what did you think you were going to do? Like, what were you feeling drawn to at that time that you were like, okay, maybe this is what I'm going to do when I grow up?
I think more when I was a bit younger. I think there's actually a streak of adrenaline junkie.
Yeah.
And there was always a sense that maybe it would be some sort of service job, you know, whether that was sort of, I don't know, fire, police, some sort of medical field, something that would provide, I guess, a decent amount of stimulation.
Sure. Yeah. Do you
Yeah.
but do you think that that was the case because of the fact that because you've always been the kind of person, and I've talked about this in the podcast also, that like you're a particularly intelligent person and usually one of, if not the smartest person in the room. I feel like that has its pros and cons always, right? And I feel like one of those cons can easily be that it would be very easily to become complacent or bored in general life, right? Like just things get like more boring or boring quicker. Maybe you get bored with them quicker and want to move on. I could see how you've always kind of had that streak of adventure and wanting to kind of push boundaries and see what you can or can't do. I mean, you used to do some pretty insane things on any kind of set of wheels. You're the reason I know how to drive stick, and definitely have, because of you driving like an insane person behind a wheel, you saved our lives one night. So like from people trying to kill us, which is a true story that I think we've talked about.
Yeah, we told that story.
Yeah. And so, I think that's part of who you are, but I wonder if, do you think you take less risks? I'm getting ahead of myself, but I would wonder if you take less risk or feel the less need to get that adrenaline rush now that you're in a job, in a career, in a world where you're constantly being stimulated intellectually and philosophically. All these boxes are getting checked for a 5 that's like such a classic. I mean, you were like the quintessential 5, right? Like you do exactly what they say 5s would do. Like you're a scientist, you research, you do all these things, and because of that, it actually comes with some sense of adventure because you're also out on a motorcycle in the desert. You go camping and find these plants. Like you do a lot of the things that you've always wanted to do, but it's kind of written into what you do. So would you think that was part of it in the early days? Like you were kind of drawn to those things because you didn't really know what you wanted to do maybe, and you were just bored or complacent and we were looking for that.
I guess my first inclination is to just say that I just spend more time with certain topics because of the freedom that being a student has allowed me to do. I think if you were to spend just as much time reading the same things I read, I don't necessarily think that we would end up in two very different places. So I don't necessarily think that there's some sort of higher innate intelligence there. I just have spent more time on a few topics than other people that are so obscure that they can maybe come across that way. However,
as someone who lived with you your entire life, I can promise you absorb knowledge in a different way.
Yeah. And hold on. We're skipping over the whole part where he's basically like a musical savant. And I would watch this guy like pick up any instrument and just intuitively start playing it.
Yeah, just figure it out. Which I don't know.
So with my ego thoroughly stroked, I think if anything, I have just always had a very innate curiosity, which I do think is a pretty human trait that you really do see among almost anyone that you meet. It's just a matter of what that thing is. And it just happens to be that by whatever means and reason or luck, that I think that there are some characteristics that I believe are associated. So I am not as well-versed in the Enneagram as you all are. I have done a little bit of honestly, when I first heard that this podcast was happening, the first thing I did was just jump into some Web of Science, some Google Scholar, and actually look up some papers. And I found some things, universities in New Zealand, I believe there's a researcher, Anna Sutton or something, maybe in the New Zealand university that has done a decent amount of Enneagram work. Some other papers. I was looking for validation for because every time I hear boxes and personality, I get pretty queasy. And it was actually very interesting to see because, as an evolutionary biologist, one of the most recent papers that my lab put out that I was lucky enough to be a part of was dealing with evolutionary convergence. And I know I'm rabbit trailing a little bit. I hopefully will make a loop back around to some of your questions here, but it's just interesting to see The paper dealt with convergence, meaning like evolutionary independence. So rather than something being a trait that a lot of things share based on ancestry, right? So if a trait evolves once, then all of the descendants sort of have that in their genetic blueprints and can make use of that new feature. Right? It's a pretty common thing that most humans are born with the same features and can do the same things, but also so are, like the whole clade of the, primates and great apes, right? In general. But what we were dealing with was, sort of instances of where all of these things emerge. If you think of like being a succulent, right? We think of that as a dry adapted plant. People love to have them on our shelves, but you can find plants that have evolved that plant habit, multiple times across the scale. And so the idea is that we consider that to be some type of what we would call a syndrome, an evolutionary trait syndrome, meaning that it's some suite of features that evolved multiple times in response to some sort of environment. But, what we were dealing with was, are these things even real? Because we can see patterns. Humans are pattern seeing machines. That's what we do. If you see just white noise, like true randomness, we can oftentimes see things and pull meaning from things. And, we are basically just cognitive bias machines, essentially. And so seeing these patterns are what we're so good at, which can be an incredibly helpful and useful tool. However, there's just a lot of things that no matter how nebulous something is, we can try to make a pattern occur. And so we were sort of challenging that concept within like our field about how to study and how to actually recognize when these patterns are useful and when they may not be as useful. And so with that mindset, I was really concerned or thinking a lot about, these sort of suites of behavioral traits across people. And if you're going to lump them into 1, 2, 3, 9, it's an interesting concept, but it actually was really reassuring to actually see that there have been some pretty consistent behaviors across populations. I'm sure you've maybe spoken with a psychologist or two. I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm.
If you've been able to hear, then I'm out of the loop there, but some great things happening. So,
they'll be on the next season. It's not out yet. So
wonderful.
Only these people, these lovely people that are joining us tonight have heard it actually.
Oh, great.
It's really fun though. And it seems to be pretty prominent in the psychology world, but it's one comment I have to say is you use Google differently than any of us do. Probably we could learn a lot. We need to do a whole lesson on just how to use Google for fives, because I think people would appreciate how you can get directly to like research papers and studies being done. And like, where you're like, I used Google and got in all this stuff. And then all these studies in Australia. And I'm like, wow, you
Google Scholar. So Google Scholar is, it's sort of the upside down of Google, where most things are actually nice, and you don't just end up in some sort of like horrific, like, I don't know, pornography dungeon. I don't know. I'm sure the algorithms have done a much better job at filtering all of that stuff by this point. But
instead you find yourself in like some terrible corner of the internet where everybody's just yelling at each other, and you've got trolls, and it's a terrible place.
I just remember at one point I had searched a blueberry, and somehow blueberry, 65 results down, all of a sudden turned into something quite nefarious. So
everything becomes nefarious if you go too far down.
Yeah. So it's really nice too. And there's, maybe there's a lot to be said, just I think in general, about what it means to take in information. I think that's probably one of the most pertinent topics of our age, what it means to actually take in information and to understand, right? Because all the information is available for all of us. I say that like all obviously paywalls excluded, which is a problem with academia. However, just with the internet in general, right? It's like we have all of this information at our fingertips, and what do we do with it? It's a pretty bizarre time to be alive, right? I spent a total of maybe 10 minutes on TikTok, and I can say that the internet's a weird endeavor. But it's a project maybe worth doing. But I think, yeah, to maybe try to stay a bit more on topic, how we at least swallow and congeal all of our information into something that is actually internally and externally consistent is, yeah, that's very difficult. Even definitely. I mean, I would almost say it's amplified within the science, like within sciences, because there's a lot of things that we can learn. But I was actually talking about this, which was just about what it means to try to run this experiment of science, right? Where we're trying. The whole point of science is not this fact gathering endeavor, but it's really more just a tool by which we learn things, in which we attempt to take our bias out of what we learn as much as possible. But the funny thing is, right, the people who are running the machine are these biased machines. And so, it's I think it's actually impossible to completely eliminate that from the equation, but it's at least so far our best attempt to try to get it learning anything. So I believe there were maybe a handful of questions I left on the table from like 5-10 minutes ago.
No, there's a couple of things I wanted to touch on. As far as any real research, the Enneagram is a very young field.
I believe some of the older papers that I saw were still only in the 80s.
Yeah. And we had
maybe 70s.
So one of the things that we kind of put a pin on that I'd like to come back to is you mentioned, how do we actually know anything? Can we talk about that?
Sure. So going back, so the Enneagram might be some sort of expression of how our brains work, right? So my personal interest, I mean, I have apart from a cursory class in neurobiology, I don't really have much experience dealing with the brain other than having one, and which I'm sure is a shared experience. We all
don't assume.
I'll make an ass out of you and me. All that to say, yeah, there are really neat things about how the brain itself works across organisms, right? I mean, we all are constrained by our neurobiology to some extent, and what I personally find interesting is just the interface in and of itself, right? I mean, everything that we think, see, hear, experience, just in any form whatsoever, is essentially just our GUI, or graphical user interface, because all stimuli, I mean, any sort of sight you see is just going to be some disturbance or perturbance in the electromagnetic spectrum that's being picked up by nerve cells that are translated essentially into electrical circuitry that is then interpreted by gray matter and white matter in our brain, which is then transferred wherever it needs to go. All right. So the brain is sort of the interface trying to make sense of all of this. And so to actually see something is to believe it, right? But to actually see something at all in and of itself is pretty wild. When you really consider what's going on, so to me, at least, the world feels no more real than seeing this sort of digital recreation of your face on my computer screen. And so whether or not there's some interference along the way or interpretation, and it's just, I don't know, super bizarre. Yeah. I went way beyond the horizon of what I actually know there. So, take what I'm saying with a grain of salt, but at least there may be a small kernel of biological.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember who I heard talking about it. It may have been Andrew Huberman, but something about how what we think that we see is only a portion of it is actually us viewing it. A lot of it has to do with our memory. So we're basically like the signals are coming in, and we're putting it through this filter of all of these constructs that we have learned over the course of our life. And we're remembering more than we're actually seeing. I don't know if that jives with anything you've learned.
I mean, I guess in some sense, right, everything is and always will just be consciousness, right? Where, I find it interesting, like just how emotional experience can shift just within a matter of moments. Right. You can be experiencing sort of the same thing, or better yet, maybe another example might be, you walk up to a waterfall or something and you just have this sort of awe-inspiring experience, and you feel very connected to that moment, and it means something. And so everything that you have in that moment and that you're bringing in is sort of tied to what it is, whatever's happening with you as an individual. And you can have the very next person walk up to that exact same spot, see the exact same thing that you're seeing, and just be, worried about the next text message that they're going to miss, or who knows whatever. And so the kind of just the general experience of life and what it is we actually gain from anything and how we experience anything sort of is this battle of internal, external forces, that there's many different ways to change that experience, from whether we are picking up the signal and how we're interpreting it and how we manage that. But a lot of that does have to do with memory, I would think, that because I often see memory as more of like a paintbrush, right? I mean, we sort of paint our memories through time. If you focus on one memory long enough, you're essentially rewriting that memory every single time that pops up. And so memory in and of itself is more of an active reconstruction in your brain than it is actually remembering anything that's actually objectively true about what happened in the past. And so if the memory in and of itself is that active and unreliable, then what it means to experience, interpret, and understand anything that has to come from memory also is sort of nothing shy of a miracle, that we can have some level of consistency at any degree whatsoever.
So to answer the question is then of
no fucking clue.
Yeah. How can we know anything? We can't, is essentially what you're saying.
No, I definitely think we can know things, but it's all within a framework of there's so many questions that I think we take for granted that are the fun things that can keep some people who are a lot more in tune with the questions themselves and a lot more well-read than I am up at night. That interesting people are saying some interesting things about that. I think it's an interesting thing.
Yeah.
So we could shift topics a little bit. I'm really curious what it's like being a 5, growing up with a brother who's a 5 and a dad who is a 5
and a mom who is not.
Yeah.
Well, so my dad is probably what I would have to point to as the first person and maybe the reason that, I don't know, maybe one of the reasons I'm doing what I'm doing. I remember he used to play these fun games with me. I think maybe he was excited that I would be relatively curious about some of the things that he would find interesting. I remember as a kid, one of my favorite hobbies was, it's kind of classic, like I would read the encyclopedia and I would just sort of memorize certain things. Like I remember wanting to memorize all the presidents or the list of, at the time, like books of the Bible or whatever it would be. But memorization in and of itself was always a fun task. And I could even recognize that as I got into college, taking, anatomy and physiology. And, it's like, well, we have 206 bones. All right, I'll see if I can have them all memorized by tomorrow. Right. So it's just like, I need to know every bone.
Did you?
Yeah.
And, you're totally like everybody else.
Well, if anybody just sits and goes over the list about anywhere from 50 to 150 times over
Maybe
like an 8 to 12 hour period, right? I mean, so it's more or less just having the drive to care about memorizing things.
I mean, I've memorized like half of my kids' children's books,
Sure.
So,
yeah. You repeat the things that many times. I think it would be, I would have to be atypical to not have kept it. But no, but I think I would do that pretty early on, where I would start saying things about the planets or whatever, because I would read he would have popular science magazines and I would, sort of find them and read and whatever I could. And I think he got excited about that because I remember there was a game he would play, which was Stump Dad. Essentially, if I could tell him something that he claimed he didn't know, he would give me like 50 cents or $1 or something. And so then every day I would have to try to stump him with something that he had never heard of before. And like he would play these little games. And that was an encouragement, I think, about like sort of this interest-led learning or just curiosity that I think he at least, I don't know, maybe he acknowledged that to some extent because he values that. And I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. And you still play that today, just against his will. You walk in and start telling him things that you're stumping him on.
Yeah, I ask him for money every single time.
Yeah, no,
So
that's really interesting. I mean, I would definitely remember you guys having a really strong. I mean, you guys have always had a really strong connection when it comes to science in a way that I don't think I took interest in science in general and until much later in life and into my adult years. Because when I was a kid and a teenager, I was too busy being a little shit. So like couldn't stop long enough to learn about anything that actually had any substance. But I think that I definitely remember you guys having that really strong dynamic and him kind of always pushing you in that way and definitely being excited. It kind of brings me to my brain kind of jumps back to one of the responses in a past episode. I think it was on the parenting episode. And where someone was talking about how they were so excited about their kid getting old enough to where all of a sudden they're starting to get interested and wants to ask questions about things and is interested. And you've talked about that, like Josiah, where like, having kids being able to communicate enough to where like now their curiosity is like, how does the moon work and how does fire work? And like, and you have these answers. Like it's the other side of being a five, right? Like you get to peak and stoke the flame of their curiosity while also like getting so much out of it. And
like 10% of the time I have those answers. Most of the time I don't.
Right. Now we have Google.
My 5-year-old, pretty much every single night, he's asking me questions about like how hurricanes work and tornadoes and snakes and whales and just all of this stuff. And I'm like, I'll give you my best guess, but gonna have to Google that later.
Pretty sure my dad did that, but he never said the word yes. He's like, here's the answer.
there have been a few things that I learned from my dad that I've just had to make slight adjustments to, right?
Yeah.
And it's yeah.
But to your point, yeah, that transfer of being able to move into that sort of wise sage mode it can be really meaningful as a 5 for sure.
I mean, it's definitely probably dad's way of really connecting with you too, right? Like that was like you were saying, kind of alluding to getting, I think it was your point you're getting to, was that I don't know, once you start talking as a child, I feel like 5s probably have this disconnect that's like, okay, how do I connect with this human being in ways that is meaningful? And well, some 5s anyway. Some 5s are more maybe in touch with their emotions and healthier places, and there's those of us who are not. And I think that definitely just from on the parenting episode, seeing the responses in the comments, I know this is a struggle. I can't obviously speak for myself, but I know I read this a lot about people being like, yeah, it was really hard. It's really hard for me to find, even in relationships, like finding that middle ground and how to communicate and how to do that, how to find that place where you are relating in a real and intimate way. And questions, curiosity, learning, that kind of thing has always been such an easy place, and definitely was kind of a staple of our household for sure. And learning all kinds of things. And me and you played music together and learned those things together as well. And we were just kind of always pushing ourselves and trying to grow and learn together, which may not have happened the way that it did if we weren't both 5s and really push ourselves to the point of hating each other.
Yeah, I mean, like our fists haven't met each other's faces in quite some time, so I think we're doing.
Not since you got big enough to pick me up off the ground by my neck, and I was like, "You win." No longer the big brother. I will relinquish that.
But it's funny you mentioned curiosity, right? I mean, I think that's been my biggest challenge going through life in general, right? Is finding ways to relate to just people around us. I mean, I don't think that that's a unique problem. I think that that's to some extent, there's a subset of the population that finds it a bit more, I don't know, easy than the other portion. But one thing that I have been able to recognize, at least in the last few years, has just been the connection via curiosity. I mean, I don't know, maybe that's a 5 strength and trying to wield that as much as possible, but I don't think it really matters what the personality type, people have interests, people have curiosities, and trying to connect on the level of enthusiasm and curiosity as a general concept rather than like the specific topics, because I know that it was very difficult for me when I would hear a topic that I wasn't directly interested in. Yeah, you could just sort of tune out and not pay it any attention and assume that there's no connection there. But then to realize that somebody it's, there's going to be someone in this world who's so into exhaust manifolds and how that, like, whatever it may be.
Yeah.
Or they're just really into, how, color and form and, sort of beauty expression and whatever it may be, for any given person. But to recognize sort of the humanity in the curiosity and interest-led understanding of the world, that may not necessarily reflect our own interests. I don't know. Maybe that's. I mean, if you tout that as a primary trait of a 5, I think that's actually a very strong basis to get to know and connect with people. I'm also not the person to offer advice on interpersonal relationships. So I'm talking to you from an abandoned room in a warehouse. No.
Yeah, I've found that as well. That's something that I had to learn more recently, was feeding the curiosity. I feel like, to your point, Jesse, that is an innate human trait. Talk to any 5-year-old and they're curious about everything.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
I think that as we grow up, it's sort of, it can get beaten out of us in a way. And I don't know if 5s maybe are more apt to hold on to it for longer, or not. But I do know that there are, depending on the environment that we grow up in, there definitely is a way to foster that and to keep that going. And for a while, I was intensely curious about a few specific things, but when I finally started to actually care about other people again, that's when my curiosity really expanded, and I started to learn how to use it as a tool of connection more. And that's still something that, especially after, all of us being isolated for the last, almost 2 years now, that's a muscle that is atrophying quite a bit. But when I was out in the world more, practicing that, just if you can, because it's kind of, this is just my observation and speculation here, but it seems like genuine kind of intense curiosity has become rare enough in this day and age that when you come across it, it's almost like it sort of snaps you out of something or wakes you up a little bit. And when you come across someone who's genuinely curious about you and interested in you, you are drawn to those people. And so that, I think you're right in that probably is a great tool that we can wield as 5s to make that connection where we might not have the skills in other areas to come about it from a different direction.
Yeah, my 57 blueprints for exhaust manifolds, I'll spend the next 7.5 hours, right? No, I think that says something a little bit different about my neuro makeup than it does being a 5. However, there's a lot to be said. I think I haven't necessarily put together a full picture here, but it is interesting to talk to people sort of within my very small botany field or biology field. But then you get into the sciences in general, and something that I have personally experienced is that you can see the jadedness that does come from people who have had sort of their curiosity beaten out of them to some extent. But I would say that more often than not, my experience has actually been, at least maybe in the biological field, I don't know, maybe the biologists are the ones that are, I don't know if we're just drinking more beer or what's happening, but they seem to be, at least more often than not, you'll meet somebody who, I might meet somebody who has received some pretty high accolades and are very well respected sort of the world over, but just sitting down and having a conversation, ultimately it's just them getting incredibly psyched and jazzed about a few things that are just, that it's ultimately that excitement that is what is making them go into work every day. And to be around that many enthusiastic learners is I consider that a very special privilege, but I don't think that it's exclusive to any type of science or academia. It's just a matter of, because like I said, you'll see just as much of the same people that it does turn into a job. It's overly formalized and it's whatever. But, ultimately, like I said before, science is driven by not only these cognitively biased machines, but we are just curious people too, So, at the core of every scientist really is just, that kid that grew up collecting insects or looking around at things and wondering what's going on. Just a matter of whether that's sort of focused outward and you get your astrobiologists or you get your astrophysicists, or you get, people who are interested in really tiny things and have great minds for conceptualizing abstract ideas. And, essentially those are some of our best mathematicians. But ultimately that does come from just a curious place of just, cool, how does that work? And, to try to have a tool to where we do formalize that and attempt to take our own bias out of it, is useful. However, like I said, ultimately it is just people who are looking around going, awesome, what's going on there? It's a very nice thing. But, I don't think that, like I said, I don't think a scientist is a special person. It's just a person who's fortunate enough to get to keep asking questions and trying to answer them. That same curiosity and that same sort of excitement can be carried over into quite literally anything. And it's a joy to see, because, it is recognizable in nearly any profession and nearly any sort of lifestyle and person that you meet. It's just a matter of, what's their thing. And so, like for my mom, my mom loves making jewelry and being creative and doing these things, but there's still a lot of curiosity that has to go into what it means to be in this world, interact with people, and create in general.
It's why shows like How It's Made was so popular. I love that show. It's such a great show.
So this is where I'm not speaking from any sort of place of knowledge or authority, because Enneagrams, I'm not sure like what a tinkerer should be. Is that the scientist? Is that a 5, or is that getting into other Enneagram types?
I'm not sure if that's a specific type so much. I know that my guess it would be anything inside of the head triad would be more apt to be a tinkerer. So that would be like a 5, 6, or 7 who just like to analyze things and think about things. Yeah, that would be my guess. But also, Cody and I are not Enneagram experts either. We've made that very, very clear. The only thing that we're really experts on are our individual experiences as a 5.
No, I will treat you as such. Okay.
Okay.
So I have a question, kind of putting you on the spot here a little bit, Jesse.
Sure.
I'm curious from a lay person's perspective, someone who's not spending all day, every day in the sciences. Cody and I have talked about this. Like he and I both got more interested in the sciences later in life. And I know for me, it was because of how I grew up in religion and how there was a bias against science in a lot of ways. But I didn't really come to appreciate science until really, I think my late 20s or like early 30s. And knowing what I know about myself now, I probably would have taken a more scientific career path. Although I love what I do now, and there's some science to it. There's like an art and a science to it. But especially in today's world, like trying to make sense of things just can be so difficult to do. And it seems to be getting increasingly difficult to do. I'm wondering if you have any advice on tools that we can learn, or skills that we can learn specifically that we can use to take a more scientific approach to gathering information and learning and trying to figure out what it is we can know.
I'm not sure about where the wisdom lies in what I'm about to say, but at least my first instinct is we tend to learn more by being wrong than we are by being right or correct. So there's a lot of things that, and I don't know how universal this necessarily is, but at least in the daily life, it's really easy to see something, assume we know how it works based on maybe previous observations, but not really putting that to any sort of test to see how wrong that may be. And, there's this classic sort of example that in, the old world, or I'm, more the Eastern Hemisphere, less North America, Latin America, everything in the Western Hemisphere. But there was this sort of concept that, every swan was white, right? And I'm pretty sure this is more wives' tale than anything. So take from it what you will. But you can walk through life and see a white swan, think, yeah, makes sense. That's coherent. That's consistent. See another white swan. Yes, exactly. We know what's up. You see another white swan. See, we know. But all it takes is to see the one swan that's either black or mixed of anything that's just not a white swan. And all it takes is the one instance to completely overturn that idea, right? And I do think that generally, as people, we have a tendency to feel comfortable with being right. And not that this is the scientific method, right? So the scientific method in and of itself is a very specific just set of tools to basically try to hopefully lay down a hypothesis and see what's going on. And when I say hypothesis, I'm being very specific there about a descriptive mechanism by which something that you observe may be happening. So not a guess. So a guess is a guess, right? That's an observation and you can have guesses about it. But when you actually have a proposed descriptive mechanism for which that thing is occurring, that's a testable hypothesis. And we can see, well, if the hypothesis is invalid, then we might expect this result. So we use very specific terms about reject and fail to reject. We don't accept hypotheses and we don't validate hypotheses. And you can never test a hypothesis to be true. You don't validate hypotheses, but what we can do in science is invalidate them. And through that invalidation, because it's easy to say that this is how something doesn't work, it's very difficult to say that this is exactly how something does work. Because in many cases, there are a whole suite of possibilities that can end up giving you a very similar result. And what I do think we have a tendency to do as people is to find we make assumptions and we tend to want to be correct about things. And so to see something happen, propose some sort of mechanism, whether or not we're formally doing this or not, but then to verify that by saying, oh yes, this other thing happened and I see that's also correct and this is also correct, and then we feel very comfortable and safe and sound in that. And that can lead to a lot of the problems that we see, social media, internet bubbles, and confirmation bias and all of this. Actually be comfortable with ambiguity, because I guess if anything, the more I am in science, the more I'm completely content to say I have no clue. And that has been, I guess, the number one skill, is to be okay with saying I have no clue about how this happens. I find this interesting. I've heard this, but something I try not to do because it can be too annoying to so many people when you sort of bet hedging too much, where you're like, let's take this with a grain of salt. But, I've heard this and I've heard this. And that uncertainty can come across as being like, oh, well, we just don't know. We can know things, but it's also just really important to understand that even the things that seem to be valid in the moment, all it takes is that one instance of that not being the case to really learn more than we've ever known before. So I think we can learn so much more by being wrong, and to be, I guess, courageous as a society and as a species, to be comfortable with not knowing things and understanding that we can challenge our ideas and learn more by being incorrect.
Well, we are we've taken up an hour of your time. So Cody, before we hop off here, Cody, was there anything else you wanted to chat about with your brother in front of a live audience?
Not that we couldn't do in another episode. I've got some thoughts now. I have some things that I'm kind of squirreling away in the old noggin right now. So I also want to let some things kind of percolate for a little bit. I think that we could definitely have a more structured conversation out of a lot of the things that were said out of this. And I will be listening back over this and editing it. So I will have even more thoughts that I can write down. So I think there's a lot of really good material here for the basis of other conversations we can kind of jump into from here. I think it's a really good place to kind of a good springboard, I think. So it's good to introduce you finally to the broader audience that we've been talking about you to. And
good to be here.
We're not talking behind your back anymore. You're officially part of the conversation. So cool. Well, let's end this.
All right. Jesse, thank you so much, sir. Yeah.
It's lovely being here. I mean, it's lovely to see your face. And Cody, it's great as always. You know, I'll see you on the holidays. You know.
Yeah, here in a couple weeks, hopefully. I actually get to give you a real hug
Well, thanks everyone. Until next time, take care.
next time.
Cheers.
Hey, it's Cody, and I wanted to say thank you for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed this episode and you're the type of person who likes helping others, would you do us a favor and share it with other people like you? If you found value in this conversation, they will too. If anything in this conversation has resonated with you, or if you have any further thoughts or questions, I want to invite you to join our community of other people like you and continue the conversation at enneagram5.com.